Welcome to the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study, hosted by Counselling and Psychological Services at RMIT University. The Counselling Armchair is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land. This podcast aims to help you manage your university life so you can be at your best. We'll be sharing with you tips on student life here and ways to enhance your mental well-being.
Welcome back to the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Your Wellbeing and Study. It is so good to have you with us again. Today we are going to explore something that we think is central to the challenges that many students experience with study, and that is perfectionism. In fact, Liz and I were chatting about our recent episode on anxiety and avoidance and realised that perfectionism is such a core issue for students, and we wondered how we hadn't addressed it until now. So Liz was pulling an excellent book off her shelf on perfectionism to get us started on thinking about this topic, and we suddenly thought, I wonder if we could talk to the author. So we are extremely lucky to be joined by Jennifer Kemp, who is a clinical psychologist and the author of the very book that Liz was pulling off her shelf, which is called the ACT Workbook for Perfectionism: Build Your Best Imperfect Life Using Powerful Acceptance and Commitment Therapy and Self-Compassion Skills. We thought Jennifer is the perfect person to guide us through the challenges of perfectionism.
No pressure felt at all. I hear a lot Jennifer. Of puns about, is this, you trying to make this perfect? Like quite often. So that is, it's part of the course when you work in this area.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. Would you mind telling us a little about yourself and how you became interested in perfectionism?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in Adelaide, and I became interested in perfectionism when I realised that I was a perfectionist, and it took me a surprisingly long amount of time to actually work out that was the case. I'd studied psychology, never came up. I'd done 2 other postgraduate qualifications and never came up. And I had re-enrolled to do the Masters in Clinical Psychology. And just before I was starting that, I did a one-day workshop by Tracy Wade here in Adelaide called Perfectionism as a Transdiagnostic Process. Mm-hmm. And I walked into the room and she was playing this song by Rachel Ferguson, which is called Never Good Enough. I've looked it up since. Actually, I asked Robin to send it to me, and I played it. I was like, oh yeah, whoa, like chills. Because the minute I heard this, she was playing it quite loud on speakers as we all sort of filed in. And my eyes just flooded with tears. It was kind of unexpected listening to the lyrics of this song. And then across the day, she just went through perfectionism and how it's related to a whole bunch of difficulties people have, mental health problems. And I was sitting there going, tick, 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 as you do when you do psychology study. But even more so, I'd had an eating disorder in my teenage years. I'd always struggled with anxiety kind of on and off. It had been something that had sort of been quite present in my life, and I had a major depressive episode in my mid-20s when I quit my job. And so I'd had a lot of the mental health problems that I was about to embark on, like studying under the clinical masters. And perfectionism was the thread that tied a lot of these things together. And I was seeing a therapist at the time for anxiety because I don't know about your students at RMIT, but I was at UniSA, and what I hear from other students doing a clinical master's is you're pretty anxious a lot of the time.
Yes.
You can't really get through that degree without getting like constant feedback on your performance, and very anxiety provoking. And psychology as a field really screens for perfectionism in a way. I think a lot of other professions do the same. You need really good grades to get into the next phase. And so Yeah, it just really resonated for me on that day. And I took my page of notes back to my therapist and said, this is what I need to be working on. Like, look at this. I remember that conversation. And that's kind of when I started exploring it as a process that tied things together in my life.
Wow.
So that was, it was about, 12 years ago now, I think, and maybe a bit longer. And it was really eye-opening. I got to try a bunch of stuff out. I didn't really have very much I could read on the topic, and just tried to work on that as something that was getting me stuck in a lot of places, basically. Yeah.
Oh,
so I tried out a lot of stuff that's in that book.
No, I think that's what makes it such a great book, actually, is that there is lived experience in there as well as your clinical knowledge, and combining those two things just makes it so much more kind of accessible and authentic. And, I'm also in the perfectionist club, and I was a bit like you, like I didn't recognise it either until someone said to me, also a counsellor, said, you're a perfectionist. And I said, no, I'm not trying to be perfect. And they're like, no, that's not it. So, it's threaded through anxiety and depression. And, I think it's just, it's really refreshing to have this conversation because we so seldom recognise that psychologists are people too.
So true.
We might be there to support others and guiding others and so on, but actually we're also humans and we have similar problems and challenges as well.
Yeah.
But I just think that makes us better equipped to help.
Oh, well, of course. I mean, how can we? We're meeting the client, as human to human. It's a human relationship. I've trained a lot of therapists, psychologists and other professions since writing the book, and I would say that it's often it's like the theme of the workshop is usually working on perfectionism in our clients and ourselves. And that's what often really resonates in the room, and the personal stories that people give me and come up to me and talk to me about afterwards are often those personal struggles and being very self-critical and all the things that come with it. Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think I really appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that experience. For people who may not have heard of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is in the title of your book, can you give us maybe just a quick overview of what it is and how it helps people? And I know that's a huge question.
Sure, yeah. I was drawn to ACT because it's a therapy that doesn't treat symptoms. It is much more about helping people live rich and fulfilling lives. And suffering is a part of the human condition. I think we're kind of hardwired for that. It's sort of never quite enough. We're never quite comfortable humans. So if we accept that there's going to be discomfort in our lives, it's about finding ways to live a life that is really aligned with what's important to us, our values, and finding ways to do that even in the presence of discomfort. So even when those uncomfortable sensations and thoughts, fly through our heads and we feel uncomfortable in our bodies, we can still do what's important. ACT is not about grin and bear it or push, white knuckle your way through to do the hard things. There's way too much of that talked about. It's about leaning in and gently allowing yourself to feel that discomfort, understand it, and then make decisions about what's important, even knowing that might make you feel uncomfortable. It's a really gentle therapy, and it's a beautiful way to help people connect with themselves and really understand what's important to them in their lives. It's lovely working with people using ACT.
Oh, thank you. That's actually a really beautiful description of what it is and what it encompasses. And I think it fits very nicely with working with the challenge of perfectionism, because you're right, there is going to be discomfort. Anything challenging is going to be discomfort, but that's how we grow, right? Making mistakes is how we learn. So...
Oh, not me. I don't make any. No, not me.
No, clearly not. None of us do.
We're perfect.
We're all perfect.
Well, if I can do it perfectly, I will. Let's just put it that way.
Yes. So. Oh, look, you never stop trying, do you? I know.
I call myself a recovering perfectionist for that reason.
I'm
never fully recovered.
Yes. We need a 12-step program for recovering perfectionists.
Maybe.
There'll be a lot of psychologists in that group.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, how would you actually define perfectionism? Because I think it's the sort of word, like it's, you know, we hear the word perfect in the title, and like my experience when I was told, I think you're a perfectionist, and I said, but I'm not trying to be perfect. And I wasn't. I didn't think I had to achieve perfectionism, but I was setting really unrelentingly high standards for myself and had no tolerance for any failure or deviance from this set of goals, which is, what, for me, how I defined it in the end. But just for our listeners, how would you define it? Yeah. People who are maybe not striving to be perfect might still be perfectionists, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of stereotypes about perfectionism which can be, not necessarily helpful. There is definitely a helpful side to perfectionism, which is, I guess, what you would call setting yourself stretch goals, striving to do your best, really wanting to do better each time. People might call that healthy striving or something like that. The sorts of perfectionism we are working with therapeutically there's a more unhelpful side of it. And I'm often at pains to point out to people that we're not trying to get rid of it altogether. We just want to scale back the unhelpful parts of it, so you can really harness that desire to do well, that desire to perform, and not have perfectionism sort of get in your way. Sometimes that's as little as sort of scaling it back 10% or something, really, because it can cause quite a lot of pain for people. So I think about perfectionism as being 5 processes, basically. So the first is setting those very high standards. So in the unhelpful side, which is what I'll talk about now, those standards tend to have a bit more of an obsessive quality to them. They can be kind of more fixed rules, like I must have a perfect GPA, or I must, get the top mark in every assignment. Those kinds of things that become quite rigid rules. And then what happens in perfectionism, and some studies have shown this, is that perfectionists tend to then, once they achieve that standard, then tend to raise the bar again. So dismiss it. Like the feeling of joy at achieving it is very short-lived. It's usually more of a feeling of relief. And then they set the bar higher again. Yes. So what we're doing is always setting it just out of reach until eventually it's always out of reach. So you end up feeling like you're failing even when you're doing really well.
I think that's such a common experience of people when they manage to achieve something, but then think, if I could have done that, then I should be able to do better than that. And that idea of the
anyone could have done that or dismiss it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you can see that link with things like eating disorders and anxiety. It's like never good enough. Like I need to look better, I need to be better. It's that same kind of process. And so with that, I guess the other thing that comes with setting those high standards is really making how you feel about yourself dependent on meeting those standards. Sort of your whole sense of self becomes wrapped up in being good enough in this way. And so if you don't meet that standard, it's crushing. Like it's a terrible feeling, a feeling of intense shame and disappointment and embarrassment. I feel like a sick dropping feeling or a twisting feeling in my stomach, which is often where you feel shame in that sort of part of our body. And I know if I'm feeling that it's probably because I've made a mistake. There's that kind of process going on. So because that sort of experience of failure, defining failure as any kind of, not meeting your standards.
Not meeting it, yep.
Yeah, then of course you come to fear failure. So the second thing I look out for in people is this sort of intense fear of failure that becomes quite controlling over your behaviour. You start to do a lot of stuff to avoid failing, and perhaps more to avoid failing than actually to succeed, to achieve your goals. It's the shift is into running away from the things that are scaring you as much as or more than striving to achieve what you really want to achieve.
I think that's such an important point, because our students really identify with that fear of failure, but they don't identify with this idea of perfectionism. But it's actually kind of two sides of the same coin. So I really think that point you made was important.
Yeah, and each of these, fear of failure, And the next one I'm going to talk about is self-criticism. These are things that people struggle with just in themselves, but you put them all together, you can see you have to have those sort of high standards and the fear of failure. And then if you don't meet those standards, remembering, of course, that you're continually raising them so that they're always out of reach, so it's inevitable you will not meet them at some point, is this pervasive self-criticism. And that in itself is something, therapeutically I would work with people just on that. That sense of never being good enough for yourself and constantly berating yourself. Lots of thoughts like, I'll never get this right, I'm a failure, I'm hopeless, I'm lazy. These sorts of looping thoughts. And that process is really destructive. It really contributes to, depression, anxiety. Self-criticism can be found across lots of other problems as well. So and I imagine students, your students would also experience that crushing sense, the foreboding, like I'm going to fail, and even having that self-criticism before they've failed. It's like, I'm going to fail, I'm hopeless at this. Like, it doesn't. Yeah, 100%. It's just anticipatory.
So we often have students come to us who might have completed an entire assignment, but they're too terrified to hand it in because they're so sure that it's not up to standard, and they would rather fail because they didn't hand it in than fail because what they produced wasn't good enough. That's a really common scenario. It's just, and you're just like, oh my gosh, you mean it's done. You could have actually just handed it in, but they just can't bring themselves to do it.
It's too terrifying.
For exactly the reason. Too terrifying. Exactly what you said there. On the money.
I've worked a lot in chronic illness in my career, and there's a stereotype of the perfectionist as the high achiever, type A, that kind of whole vibe. But working in chronic illness, it was really obvious that you would find people that were frozen, that weren't able, I think similar to what you're saying around not being able to hand assignment in, they don't they're not doing well at all, not getting close to their goals because it's just so overwhelmingly scary, the thought that they may fail. And so you'll see people who are both like burning out, striving, and people who are locked and frozen and unable, having to drop out because they may have done all the work but can't hand it in, which is that's hard.
It's so hard.
So maybe with those things in mind, those 5 processes, why is it so hard to let go of perfectionistic ways of thinking?
Well, I think we get locked into behavioural patterns that reinforce what we're doing. It's certainly socially, like the perfectionistic patterns are socially rewarded. As I said, they're actually, like, the striving is rewarded at university, particularly if it's a competitive program. The small number of people. Such a good point.
They certainly don't give out awards for not striving, do they?
No, they don't give any.
My son did year 12 last year, and at the end of the year, he worked consistently hard throughout his education, but he didn't get in the stratosphere marks. He got really good marks, enough to get him where he wanted to go, and he worked really hard, but because he didn't achieve excellence in an area, he didn't get awarded, and they gave out all these awards at the graduation, and afterwards he said, I feel a bit demoralised because I actually worked really hard, and he did, and I don't because it wasn't deemed excellent, I didn't get the sort of pat on the back. So we're even when kids are little, we're already setting this up to win the award, to get the pat on the back, to be special, you have to reach a certain standard of excellence. This word excellence, comes into the lingo really early.
It does, and there can be some cultures are very much rewarding of this too. I can't speak to all cultures, of course. I have done a fair bit of work in Singapore, and the reason I was invited to do work there was because of the feedback I was given was that it's become quite baked into the culture there, so much so that at the end of your final year of school, you're kind of given a potential grade, like your potential, if you go into the public service, that potential score will determine the entire trajectory of your career in the public service,
Oh
how
my
fast you
goodness.
will be like promoted. So there's this pressure point to achieve at school, which has really culturally like become a huge thing
Embedded.
around schooling. Yeah, embedded.
Yeah.
And I've also found it quite common amongst first generation Australians. So their parents have immigrated to Australia and they're feeling a lot of pressure. Oh, and overseas students as well. Like there's been a lot of money invested into your education and you need to achieve. And even if it isn't explicitly stated, and sometimes it is, it's felt, that I have to achieve. And so that creates an environment for perfectionism. It doesn't create it, but it sort of like creates the petri dish, I guess, that you're kind of growing it on, right?
Yes, I would put myself in that category. And I do think that when your parents have migrated to another place, there's this, as you say, sometimes it's implicit, sometimes it's completely explicit, but the sacrifice a massive sacrifice was made for your future. That's what my parents would say. We came here for our children. And so you have to make good on that sacrifice. That's just known, and like I understand them. I understand their perspective, especially now as an older person, but when I was younger, it's like, oh my God, the pressure of like, I have to make good on your life choices. What the hell?
Yeah.
So I really do think that that's absolutely true. And international students as well, I think, that get sent to Australia to get their education, it is incredibly expensive. Every semester costs their parents massive amounts of money. So that comes with so much pressure to be successful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can just even learn it as well. Like I never felt in my childhood, never felt pressured. It was not rewarded for good grades. I never felt pressured. It was I was very lucky. Both my parents went to university, so it was probably just expected that I would go, but not in a like you must go, but just more like that's kind of what we do around here sort of way.
That's the norm. No question.
That's the norm. When I finished the book, my dad had a copy of it. He just went, I'm sorry. And I think he realised, I know, bless him, because, I watched him. He's always been a perfectionist. He's hard on himself, a little bit hard, high expectations of others sometimes. Never felt it as real pressure though. And I think I watched it though. I watched how frustrated he would get when he made a mistake. I could see it in action, and I guess you do just learn it as well. So there's lots of ways that it's reinforced. And of course, we get into these behavioural patterns around like running, fighting or hiding from the failure, and the self-criticism too, because we don't want that either. And sometimes those strategies, they work. So they work in the short term anyway. So we just keep doing it, There are strategies that work. So like if I check my assignment, I will find mistakes and it will be better most of the time, you would think. So that's a strategy that works. It's when we get stuck checking it for days on end and checking it to the point where we're still finding mistakes, so it's therefore not perfect, or, right to 11:59 p.m, before we click send, then it's really, not necessarily time well spent. But as a strategy, it works, right? We just get that you're overusing it, and it's about managing anxiety at that point, right? It's managing that fear. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Such a good point. And so you started to talk about the ways that people commonly cope with perfectionism, like maybe some of the maladaptive ways that people cope with perfectionism. So that would be one of them, would it be? Like just constantly sort of checking. What are some other ways that you have noticed that people respond to perfectionism?
Yeah, so you'll get that kind of active checking and behaviour, which can look a whole bunch of this is where it can, there is a line where perfectionism can sort of end up into OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, because checking is a feature of OCD too, and reassurance seeking as well. So getting, is it good enough? Am I good enough? Like asking other people. Then you'll get the kind of more passive avoidance behaviours, which is more like, not handing things in or not doing it at all. Procrastination can often fit into that bucket, which is such a common problem for most of us, I think. Plenty of things on my list that I'm procrastinating on at the moment, that the longer I leave it, the more anxious I'll get. And some of them But I panic. The reason I don't really, like, I probably didn't pick up that I was a perfectionist is that I've never handed an assignment in late in my whole, like, 4 degrees, right? And I've never failed anything or got pretty close in my undergraduate. I tend to panic early. So I'm panicking about a presentation, not quite, but getting anxious about it that I don't have to deliver until September and then again in November.
Right.
So that's making me anxious now. So we'll get started on it soon. But that's the way, like, I panic really early. Whereas some people, you know, it's much closer to the deadline, isn't it? And so then you can't perform to your best because you don't have the time left. So you can see people underperform in that sense compared to what their potential is because they're really locked in excessive checking and those kinds of behaviours or more passive avoidance.
And you're absolutely right. It then reinforces this idea that I'm not good enough, especially if they're not performing well, and then the cycle goes on. I think what you said earlier about, you know, being in competitive programs or having sort of cultural factors or cultural kind of influences that influence these high expectations that we have, you know, how can people deal with when those standards are external to them? You know, like a student trying to get into medicine or into a postgraduate course where, like you said, perfectionism is rewarded.
Yeah, it is really hard. As a therapist, I try to get my clients, my university student clients, to kind of really focus on their own lane. So try to minimize the amount of comparisons they're making to other people and focus on identifying what works best for them in terms of the way they study, because everyone is different, and running their own race, essentially. And that's super hard, particularly when everyone around you is comparing grades and kind of, you know, again, medicine, you're doing a undergraduate medical science degree and there's only so many spots in medicine, you know, so there is a lot of pressure to be one of the top students. So trying to get people to unhook from that and focus on their own game, because their own race. They almost need like blinkers on, like a racehorse, to sort of talk about that. One strategy I try to never use, it's so tempting, is to argue with those, like logically with the standards. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like, and don't you just find yourself drawn into that? And you do that for yourself.
Oh my gosh. I've done it, Jennifer. And afterwards I'm going, what am I doing?
No, it
doesn't work. It definitely doesn't work. You can't break the logic for them. There's just no, you just can't.
No, it's like OCD logic. It's like, it's always like, but actually, you know, and like it doesn't need to make sense, but it's like, you know, sure, I'm safe, but what if this happens? You know, it's always that.
Exactly.
So it doesn't work. The variants of that I have that have been helpful, particularly things like proportional effort, which I've got a wonderful client that's just about to finish their honours year, and I was lucky enough to work with them sort of from the end of school, so now it's the end of fourth year. I know.
That's amazing.
And we had this conversation at the beginning of first year uni, and he's in a STEM sort of subject, and it was about proportional effort, and he's saying, well, every week we've got these quizzes and we've got these pracs and we've got an exam and an assignment, like there's so many. I said, so these quizzes that you're spending hours and hours on preparing for, how much are they worth? Oh, you know, there's 10 of them, there's 10 weeks, there's like 8 questions in each one, and then the total score is, and like, so you do the maths, how much is each question worth? And he's like 0.2% of my grade or something, right? Like, you're the mathematician, you work it out, right? Okay. So like, let's get these in perspective. You've got to work smarter, not harder, and particularly in subjects where there's like that heavy load of assessments, and medicine is another one, like just so much stuff. Be smart about what you invest your time in, and you'll end up, definitely doing better overall. So that's one strategy. I'm not saying, like, certainly you can still aim for that standard. Let's try to let go of maybe some of the rigidity around it. But again, I'd rather they just work that out for themselves. Like, you can't tell people.
No, that's
for anyone
true.
listening, it's okay. You can have your standards. It's all right.
Yes, exactly.
But where they're killing you, like perhaps we
Maybe
find
have a
some
look
other
at
ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I sometimes say to my clients that what worked for me as a student is to realise that breadth was always better than depth, because you could end up like really digging into one topic, using all your time trying to cover it perfectly and fully, and then you miss the other 5, and then you get to the exam and the question is not on the one that you covered beautifully in depth, but it's on one of the other 5. So I always thought it was better to do, patch up job on all 5, so that whatever question I got, I was going to be able to say something. I was going to be able to answer something. I was probably going to, if I was playing the numbers game, statistically more likely to do better on that exam than if I spent all my time really drilling into one of the topics.
Yeah, that doesn't, and I would agree with that. I really struggled in my undergraduate degree with all of my exams in particular. I remember my first year psychology exam was 360 multiple choice questions. So
hideous.
And it's just so many facts, and I'm not really good at memorizing stuff. And I would do well in my assignments, but pretty badly in my exams. I do think I learnt eventually, and I guess like second or third time round, that I need a lot of repetition.
Yeah.
Virtually kind of cue cards, color-coded, and it's very time consuming for me to memorize stuff. And I tell you now, I have been taught this, and even my son, who's now in year 12, last year did psychology in year 11, and he had to memorize the parts of the brain, and I had to quiz him on it. It was the 4th time I'd learned that, and I still didn't know it. And now sitting here, I'm like, temporal lobe, occipital lobe,
Especially when it's so kind of abstract, you can't really connect it to anything tangible.
No.
Yeah, you can't.
Oh my gosh.
It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Wow. I had the same experience with my son. He did psychology in year 12 as well, and I was helping him revise, and I was like, I don't remember any of this stuff. Because we don't really talk about brain structures very often in counselling. Maybe we might talk about the amygdala or something like that, the fear centre of the brain, whatever, but we won't talk in depth about the structures. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, it's not there anymore. It's gone.
It was never in there though. I could never, I could never translate that. I still think, and this stats was another area that I similarly, the way it was taught was just like memorizing, and it was really hard for me, and that's sort of one of the subjects I really struggled with, and I have done it 2 or 3 times now. Still difficult. So working with your strengths, I think that the breadth idea is great. Neurodivergent brains prefer depth over breadth, so that's where some of your clients might
struggle.
Because you're actually motivated, if you're interested in a topic, to dive deeply into it and know everything about it. That's naturally where your brain will go, and then the memorizing part is really hard, particularly for the parts that just aren't as interesting.
Yes.
So working with whatever your neurotype is really important as well. And so again, it's just being helps to know what your neurotype is, working with those kinds of things. Also, I think it's really good to do some actual little experiments to see. So when I went through my master's, knowing now that I was a perfectionist, at the time I had a 3 and a 5-year-old at home, and so for the first time, it was really clear where my values were. Other times I'd studied, I could spend that extra time, but this was I have 8 hours of daylight time without children around, and I have evenings, and I'm not good in the evenings. So I have to be really smart about how I study. And I decided, as they walk you into a clinical master's, they say, now you've got here, it's great, you can let go of needing good grades. This is all about your, learning the skills to be a therapist. Which is hilarious considering that they have fully rewarded the grades right up until this point.
Yes, exactly.
And so I worked really, really hard to say, I'm going to put in a credit's worth of effort for a credit grade. I couldn't aim, I know they say P's make degrees, but that felt a bit risky for me and didn't live up to my standards. I couldn't lower them like that.
You could get them down a bit, but not that far.
Getting them down from an HD, so And so going for a credit, I'd have to say to myself, is this credit worthy? Have I done enough to get a credit? and then I have to hand it in. Sometimes I hand it in early because it was better that I got rid of it. I'd done the effort that I needed. It was good enough. And I always got either a credit, sometimes a distinction, but the grades didn't matter in the clinical masters, so it was really fine. But every time I went to hand it in, it was really hard. It was like that kind of, like feeling like...
My hand was trembling, like almost like, or pressing the submit button.
Yeah, it was really uncomfortable. If I think back now, this is before I learned ACT, it would have been really helpful to have a few ACT skills, like to sort of notice how I was feeling and try to make room for that discomfort a little bit and remind myself of what my values are and what's important to me. I was kind of doing it, but I was a little bit white-knuckling through it as well. So... and again, like lowering your standards in that sense feels really uncomfortable, but it was more of I'm not going to work too much, because if I decide that I want to get this perfect or even like a lot better, I'm going to lose my weekend with my kids.
Yes.
And it came to the crunch at the end of my master's where you had to hand in your thesis. And I thought my thesis was pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. And I sent it in to my supervisor, and this is sort of maybe about early November. And there was only 12 people in my cohort, and I think maybe just half actually finished within the 2 years because they made it much harder to finish for various reasons. But I was determined that I was going to finish by the end of the year because I had the summer holidays with my kids, and then I would get a job, right, starting in February. And school went back. And so I was looking down the barrel of like losing the whole of summer with my children, because I got back this email that said, well, it's okay, but it needs just a few more rounds of feedback and then it'll be good. Now, I don't know if you remember thesis, how long a round of feedback takes. Like each one is going to be weeks and weeks, each round. And I burst into tears. Lucky he wasn't here with me. It was a thesis on perfectionism, and my supervisor was a perfectionist, there's no doubt.
Oh, God. Yikes.
And quite rigid around it. And so I ended up, taking a couple of days, thinking about it. I made all the changes that he'd suggested, and then I just handed it in. I just submitted it around him.
Good on you.
Wow.
And, I still to this day don't know what my grade is. Part of me is probably scared to know. But I passed and I finished my master's and I got to move on with my life. And that was the key. And so I think if I hadn't practiced that for 2 years, there was no way I would have been able to make that call. I don't know that he was very happy with me. We're not maintaining close connection, but
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of leads me to the next question, which is, how do you aim for good enough? Like you were saying, I'm going to aim for a credit. That's good enough. I don't, I don't need to get high distinctions anymore. I'm in the master's program now. But how do you sort of switch your thinking when you're used to being in that, and you have that rigidity around must get HDs, otherwise may as well have failed. 1% less than what I think I should get is a failure. How do you switch your thinking into good enough, and how do you recognise what is good enough?
I think the only reason I could do that was because I had these small children and very limited time available to me to actually study. I don't often ask people to switch their thinking because, again, you get stuck in that kind of arguing with yourself loop. But I would help people identify where their behaviours are causing them problems and see if they can, make a cutoff. So maybe I'll do 5 drafts instead of 15, and at that point it feels uncomfortable, but I can still hand it in. It's dealing with the uncertainty is the key there, that it will be good enough, and that the self-criticism, the risk, the fear of the self-criticism and the failure and all the uncomfortable things that show up in us. But if we focus on 5 good drafts, for example, and really put thinking into that and really do our best effort, then the next 10 are going to be literally spell checking anyway. It's not, there's got to be a line. So at some point, getting people to gradually bring that back, and 2 things can happen. They can get the grades anyway, which is great, great outcome, less work, same grades. They can not get the grades, and then you can realise that the world didn't end, actually.
Yep, exactly.
But the most, I think, after all that struggle, the biggest difference has ultimately been self-compassion. Because when you do make mistakes, and I now make them so far more frequently than I ever, oh my goodness. Like trying to catch me via email, having me turn up to meetings, like it's like a bit more of a shit show, to be honest now. And I've really hit capacity, but
yeah,
I'm so much more compassionate about it. Like to myself, yes, I made a mistake. Was it the end of the world? Not really. It doesn't really matter. Will anyone really remember?
Yes.
In the past, that mistake I was telling you about earlier, where I was meeting this really important people and I had the wrong camera attached, and it was really embarrassing. I could have beaten myself up about that for days in the past, this embarrassment. I was like, now, I let it go. What does it matter? It's not...
The world didn't end. It was a moment in time and it's gone now. Yeah.
Yeah, and so practicing that sort of softening around the way you speak to yourself about it has been probably the biggest transformation, really, for me.
Absolutely.
It takes practice.
I often say to people, it's not about being the best, it's just about doing your best. And your best is based on a bit of a cost-benefit analysis, right? Of like you said, I want time with my family and my kids and my weekends and my summer. And this is how much time I have to give to this task. And so that has to be the bar. That's the good enough, because it's bound by the other demands in your life or the other wishes, not even demands, just like, oh my gosh, we should have more fun in life. We should do more things we enjoy. That's so important, and we don't prioritise it at all. We really should.
Yeah. No, it is to step back and say, really, what is this costing me?
Yeah.
I've had another field that definitely rewards perfection is law. I worked with a young early career lawyer once who was working 4 or 5 hours longer than everyone else. And a lot of that, she'd been told that, there can't be a mistake in these contracts. So there was so much extra checking she was doing. I've worked with someone who was working drafting in an architect's office, and they were so worried about making mistakes that they were sort of rechecking calculations by hand. Now, perhaps some of these things may now be almost really heading into OCD. It's hard. There is a line there we need to assess for and look for. But the perfectionism there is costing so much when it's keeping you in the office, and what are you missing out on? So if you can just scale that back, if you can limit the number of times that you're checking and save 1 hour a day, even if it's just an hour to do nothing, just to rest, that's a valuable hour.
Lie down in the sun and shut your eyes.
Maybe you get out the latest edition of Zelda and play that for an hour. That's whatever,
exactly.
Just get your Animal Crossing up to date for the day, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
It's still valid. It's a valid use of time, because you need that time to unwind. And so I think it's really working out where the costs are. That's the key. I don't try and change people's standards explicitly. I have seen people really balk at that. Really want to pull away or even pull out of therapy if we go down that road. Yes. So I respect that. Let's just work out, minimize the costs. And I think with that comes, if we can add some self-compassion into the mix, then the standards become a little less frightening and a little less rigid as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I'm just looking at our remaining questions, Melissa, and I think we've sort of mostly covered them, but I think, just what we were thinking, self-compassion is like a bit of an antidote to perfectionism in a way, because it hopefully will soften that self-criticism. And I often do think about how mean we are to ourselves in a way we would never be to another person that we care about.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think that's the case?
I think we feel like it's necessary, though.
Yeah,
I think we really buy into this tough love kind of idea.
Yes.
You just have to be a bit hard on myself, and that'll motivate myself. My favourite metaphor, you can probably finish up with this if you're ready. But my favourite metaphor for that is the two teachers metaphor, which I love. I use a lot with clients. It's in the book, so if people have it, they can certainly find it there. And also on my website, free, there's a handout of this metaphor. It goes roughly like this. So imagine that you were the parent of a child that was just starting school, so they're around 4 or 5 years old. They're a normally developing child, so they've got some strengths and some areas that they're struggling with at school. Maybe they're struggling a bit with their numeracy, or having trouble sitting still and concentrating. They want to run around and play. They're just a normal little person, 5 years old, and they have two teachers and a job share situation, I'm thinking. Now, they've really been struggling this day at school, and their first teacher comes up to them and says, "What's going on here? Why haven't you got this done? You should have done this already. I've shown everyone how to do this. You need to get this fixed, get this done." Okay, right. It's a little person just started school. Pretty full on. The second teacher, when your child is struggling, has a different approach. So they come up to your child and say, "Hey, I can see you're getting a bit stuck here. Why don't you show me where you're finding it difficult? Let's sit down and do a few more before you go out and play." Now, which of those two teachers do you think you would prefer for your child? The first teacher or the second teacher? What do you guys think?
The second teacher, 100%.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Yeah. Which teacher do you think would help your child learn and grow as a little human? Which is really going to foster their learning? The first one or the second one?
Definitely the second
one.
You still think the second one? Okay. All right. Which teacher sounds like the way that you talk to yourself? The first one or the second one?
The first one.
The first one.
Yeah, ouch.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a little aha moment. Because if you notice the second teacher, we often feel like we need to be hard on ourselves, or we'll be lazy and unproductive, or our performance will drop. But if you listen to the second teacher, they're showing sort of some of the key signs as key elements of self-compassion. There's a motivation to help. So I can see that you're really struggling there. Can you show me where you're getting stuck? There's a warmth and a curiosity there with that. And they still hold your child accountable to actually do the work. So why don't we sit together and do some more before you go out and play?
Yes.
So it is possible to hold yourself accountable, and it is possible to still to support yourself to do better work in a softer, kinder way, more compassionate way. And I love that metaphor, because I think so many people, I've done this with rooms of 200 people, and there's a lot of kind of
Yeah, right in the feels.
Been practicing, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that metaphor too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful one. I didn't invent it, but I do love it.
No, but you tell it so well.
No, thank you so much. I think that was such a beautiful way of ending this episode, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. I feel like people have so much to think about listening to this, so thank you. We really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this informative episode of the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study. Our special thanks and gratitude go to clinical psychologist Jennifer Kemp, author of the ACT Workbook for Perfectionism, Build Your Best, Imperfect Life Using Powerful Acceptance and Commitment Therapy and Self-Compassion Skills, for sharing her expertise and shedding light on the complexities of perfectionism. And if perfectionism is a challenge for you, I encourage you to get a hold of her book, as it is packed full of information and helpful strategies, and you can order it online via Amazon or via Jennifer's website. We'll also pop the details of how to get a hold of Jennifer's book in our show notes. We hope that our episode was helpful in recognising unhelpful perfectionism and in giving you some ideas on how to tackle unhelpful perfectionism so that it does not have to have such an incapacitating effect on your life. It's not about having no expectations, but rather about learning how to set realistic and reasonable expectations and to engage more self-compassionate ways of thinking. This takes time and requires patience, but recognising the problem of perfectionism is a good place to start. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe to our podcast and share it with anyone who might benefit from these insights. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a review. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself.
Thanks for joining us today on the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned a useful thing or two. Have a great week, and just remember that life can be amazing. See you next time.
Isn't life so amazing? Sometimes it can get crazy, but hey, that's okay. We've got another day to make mistakes and say sorry. There's no sense in our worry, 'cause all we can do is try our best to make it through with love.